It was my son's wife who opened the door, not my son. She looked me up and down, the way you might look at a salesperson who has arrived uninvited. "Oh," she said. "We weren't expecting you until later." Behind her, I could hear my grandchildren laughing somewhere deep inside the house, a sound that had kept me going for the past 3 years. My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 71 years old, and this is the story of how I finally stopped shrinking myself to fit inside someone else's life. Before I go on, I want you to know that if any part of what I'm about to share sounds familiar, if you felt invisible in the very family you built from nothing, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because the ending surprised even me. Let me take you back to a Sunday in early October. I had driven 45 minutes to my son Daniel's house in the suburbs, the same house I had helped him purchase 7 years before with $85,000 of my retirement savings. I had handed him a check on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at his kitchen table. He had cried. His wife, Renata, had hugged me and said, "You're the reason this family works, Margaret. You really are." That was 7 years ago. On this particular Sunday in October, I was carrying a ceramic dish I had spent the morning preparing, a slow-roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, the dish Daniel had requested every birthday since he was 9 years old. I had also brought a small envelope inside my coat pocket. It contained a check for $4,000 to help cover what Daniel had called a rough patch with their car payments and some unexpected dental bills for the kids. Renata stepped aside to let me in. She didn't offer to take the dish. I followed her to the kitchen and set it on the counter myself. The house smelled of the expensive diffuser oils I had bought them for Christmas. I noticed the new sectional sofa in the living room, cognac leather, enormous, and the mounted television that must have been at least 70 inches wide. I did not ask about the rough patch. "Daniel's on a call," Renata said without looking at me. "It could be a while. You can wait in the sitting room." I sat in the small room off the hallway, the one with the stiff chairs that no one ever used. Through the wall, I could hear Renata on her phone, laughing softly at something. My grandchildren, twins named Sophie and Freddie, were 8 years old. I had not seen them in 6 weeks. I could still hear them somewhere upstairs, but no one brought them down. I waited for 40 minutes. When Daniel finally appeared, he was still wearing his wireless earpiece, which he did not remove. He looked tired and distracted. He kissed me on the cheek, a quick, dry press, and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. You didn't have to bring food." "I wanted to," I said. "It's your favorite." He nodded at the wall. "Renata said you're staying for dinner?" "If that's all right." Something crossed his face. Not annoyance, exactly. Something flatter than that. Resignation, maybe. "Sure," he said. "Of course." That night at the table, Renata spoke at length about a renovation they were planning for the master bathroom. Marble tiles, underfloor heating, a freestanding tub she had seen in a design magazine. She mentioned the cost, somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000, and paused in a way that felt practiced, as if she had rehearsed this part. I recognized the pause. I had been responding to that pause for 15 years. I said nothing. I cut my chicken into small pieces and listened to my grandchildren argue about a cartoon. After dinner, while I was washing up in the kitchen, because I always washed up without being asked, Daniel came and leaned against the counter. He had finally removed the earpiece. "Mom," he said quietly, "about that bathroom renovation." "I know," I said. "We're just a little stretched right now with—" "I know, Daniel." He looked at his feet. "You're the only person we can really turn to." I kept washing. The water was very hot. I could feel it reddening my hands. "I'll see what I can do," I said. He patted my shoulder twice and went back to the living room. I drove home alone in the dark. 45 minutes. I had given him the $4,000 check in the envelope before I left, tucked it into his jacket pocket while he was hugging me goodbye. He hadn't mentioned it. I wasn't sure he'd even noticed. 3 weeks later, I was hospitalized. It was a Tuesday morning. I had been feeling short of breath for several days, something I had been ignoring, the way women of my generation are so thoroughly trained to ignore their own bodies. My neighbor Patricia found me sitting on my front step at 7 in the morning, unable to stand up properly. She drove me to the hospital herself. The doctors found an irregular heart rhythm. Not dangerous yet, they said, but something that required monitoring, medication adjustments, and rest. I called Daniel from the hospital bed. It was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. He answered on the third ring. "Mom, what's up?" I told him where I was. I told him what the doctors had said. There was a pause. "Are you okay? Like, is it serious?" "They want me to stay overnight for observation." Another pause. Longer. "Okay. Do you need anything? Do you want me to... I could probably get there by this evening. But Renata has the kids, and there's this presentation tomorrow morning that I've been..." "It's fine," I said. "Don't worry about it." "Are you sure? Because if you really need me there..." "I said it's fine, Daniel." He didn't come. Patricia sat with me until 9 o'clock that evening. She brought me a sandwich from the cafeteria and a magazine she'd bought from the gift shop, and she held my hand during the part of the afternoon when my heart monitor beeped at irregular intervals and the nurses came to check on me. She was 74 years old and had a bad knee and had driven herself to the hospital on a whim because she noticed I looked pale. Daniel called the next morning to ask how I was. Renata sent a text message that said, "So glad you're okay. Let us know if you need anything." I lay in my hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something I had never quite allowed myself to feel before. Not sadness, not disappointment, but a cold and clarifying anger. The kind of anger that doesn't burn, the kind that illuminates. I thought about the $85,000 for the house. I thought about the $22,000 I had contributed to their wedding. The venue, the flowers, the photographer Renata had insisted on because she'd seen his work in a magazine. I thought about the $15,000 I had lent them 3 years ago when Daniel's business went through a difficult period, money that had never been mentioned again and certainly never repaid. I thought about the car I had helped them buy for Renata the year before, $11,500, because her old one had failed its inspection. I thought about the private school fees for Sophie and Freddie, $3,200 a semester, which I quietly covered because Daniel had mentioned once, in passing, that they were having trouble affording it. I had never added up these numbers before. Not once. The habit of not adding them up had felt for a long time like generosity. Lying in that hospital bed with a heart monitor on my chest, it felt more like something else. I reached for the small notepad in my handbag and wrote down every figure I could remember. The total came to just under $160,000 over 15 years. I put the notepad back in my bag. I looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then I thought about something my own mother had said to me decades ago when I was still young and newly married and full of certainty about how life worked. She had said, "Margaret, remember that you cannot love anyone into treating you well. People treat you the way they have decided to treat you." I had never fully understood that until now. I was discharged on a Thursday morning. Patricia picked me up. "You look different," she said as I got into her car. "I feel different," I said. She glanced at me. "Good different or bad different?" I thought about it. "Clear," I said. "I feel..." That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had written the check for $85,000, where I had filled out the forms for the private school fees, where I had quietly prepared every envelope that had traveled from my life into theirs, and I began to make decisions. The first decision was about the bank. Daniel and I shared a savings account that I had opened for emergencies. His emergencies, as it turned out. There was $12,500 in it. I called the bank and arranged to close the account and transfer the balance back to my personal savings. The woman on the phone was efficient and kind, and the whole transaction took 11 minutes. The second decision was about my will. I had a meeting scheduled with my solicitor, Graham, for the following week regarding an unrelated matter. I called and asked if we could expand the agenda. He said of course. The third decision was the most important one, and it had nothing to do with money. I decided to stop waiting. I had spent 15 years waiting for Daniel and Renata to become the family I needed them to be. Waiting for them to call when nothing was wrong. Waiting for them to visit without a reason. Waiting to feel like a mother rather than a resource. I had arranged my entire emotional life around that waiting, and I had mistaken the waiting itself for love. No more. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window and watched the garden for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my old friend Helen, who lived in Edinburgh and whom I had been meaning to call properly for almost a year. We talked for 2 hours. It was the best conversation I'd had in months. Daniel called 4 days later. Renata must have noticed the joint account had been closed. "Mom?" His voice had the careful quality of someone who has planned what they're going to say. "I got a letter from the bank about the joint account." "Yes," I said. "I closed it." A pause. "Why?" "Because I needed to reorganize my finances." "Okay, but that was our emergency fund. Renata and I were counting on that being—" "It was my money, Daniel." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that, Mom. I just think it would have been nice to have a conversation about it first." I let that sit between us for a beat. Then I said very calmly, "Were to have a conversation with me before asking for help with the bathroom renovation? Or were you planning to use the same pause you always use at the dinner table?" Silence. A different kind of silence. "That's not fair," he said, but his voice had gone quiet. "Daniel, I was in the hospital for 24 hours and you didn't come. Patricia, my neighbor, sat with me for most of the day. You sent a message asking if I was okay and then went to your presentation. I asked if you needed me there. You said it was fine. I was in a hospital bed with a heart monitor on my chest. I shouldn't have had to say that I needed you. You should have already been on your way." The silence this time was very long. "Mom, He stopped. Started again. "I didn't think it was that serious." "I know you didn't." I could hear him breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Younger, less managed. "Are you angry with me?" "I'm not angry," I said, and this was true. The cold clarity from the hospital had not become anger. It had become something more durable. "I'm honest. Maybe for the first time in a long time." "What does that mean?" "It means I love you very much, Daniel. It means I always will. And it means that I've been making your life easier in ways that have made mine smaller. And I've decided to stop doing that." Another long silence. "Is this about money?" "It's about everything," I said. "The money is just the part that's easiest to count." 2 weeks after that phone call, I did something I had been postponing for 8 years. I booked a trip to Portugal. I had first mentioned Portugal to Daniel at a family dinner in the year Renata was pregnant with the twins. I had seen a documentary about the Algarve coast and had felt something stir in me. A longing, a curiosity, a quiet voice that said, "You should go there." Daniel had said, absently, that it sounded nice. Then he had asked if we could talk about the baby's nursery. In the years that followed, Portugal had remained a small, private wish I carried like a stone in my pocket. Every time I started to think about planning it, something came up. A school fee, a car, a rough patch, an emergency. My own wishes kept deferring to everyone else's needs, and I had let them defer, because somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that this was what it meant to be a good mother. I sat at my computer on a Tuesday morning in November and booked 2 weeks in the Alentejo region, a small guest house run by a couple who had left their corporate jobs in London to grow olive trees and make wine. It had wonderful reviews. It had a garden. It had a covered terrace where you could have breakfast in the sun. I booked the flights. Business class. First time in my life. Then I called Patricia and told her what I'd done, and she laughed and said, "It's about time, Margaret. It is absolutely about time." I landed in Lisbon on a Saturday morning in January, which is a beautiful time to visit because the tourists are few, and the light is golden and slant, and the tiles on the old buildings glow like honey. A driver from the guest house met me at arrivals, a young man named Tomas, who had a warm, easy manner and spoke excellent English. He drove me south through the Alentejo, through rolling hills of cork oak and olive, and the particular red-brown soil that gives that part of Portugal its warm, ancient quality. The guest house was called Quinta das Oliveiras, the olive farm. My hosts, James and Anna, were in their 50s, quietly confident, the kind of people who have made a deliberate life and wear it with ease. My room had whitewashed walls and a window overlooking the garden and a bed with cotton sheets the color of cream. I slept for 10 hours the first night. In the mornings, I ate breakfast on the terrace. Fresh bread, local honey, strong coffee, the eggs from their own hens. In the afternoons, I walked the surrounding countryside or visited the small hilltop towns nearby, Monsaraz, Mertala, Évora. Places so old and still that walking through them felt like stepping sideways in time. In the evenings, I had dinner on the terrace with James and Anna and whatever other guests were staying, and the conversations were the kind I had forgotten were possible, wide-ranging, curious, unhurried. On the 4th day, I met a woman named Cecilia. She was 68, recently widowed from Sao Paulo. She had come to Portugal alone for a month after her children had suggested, in the gentle language families use for such things, that she might be better off, closer to them, in an apartment they had found for her near their neighborhood. "They want to manage me," she said plainly, over a glass of wine on the terrace. "They love me. I know they love me. But they want to manage me. And I decided I didn't want to be managed. I want to be lived." I recognized something in that phrase immediately. I want to be lived. Not maintained, not managed, not deployed as a resource. Lived. Cecilia and I walked together most mornings after that. She had a dry, precise humor and an enormous laugh that seemed to surprise even her when it came. She had been a civil engineer for 30 years. She had raised 3 children more or less alone after her husband's business required him to travel most of their children's childhoods. She was, she said, done with being the quiet anchor that held everyone else in place while they went wherever the current took them. "What will you do instead?" I asked. "I'm going to stay in Portugal for 6 months and see how I feel," she said. "After that, who knows? Maybe I'll like it enough to stay longer." I thought about this for several days. On the 5th morning at the Quinta, I woke before dawn and could not get back to sleep. I wrapped myself in the thick wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and went out to the terrace with my journal. A plain notebook I had bought at an airport bookshop the previous month and had barely written in. I sat in the dark with the blanket and the notebook and a glass of water, and I tried for the first time in a very long time to simply be honest with myself. The question I kept circling was this: had Daniel always been this way? Or had I made him this way? It is a hard question to sit with. Harder in some ways than the question of what to do next. Because the answer, I suspected, was both. Daniel had grown up understanding that I would manage things, that I would anticipate needs before they were expressed, that the machinery of the family, financial, emotional, logistical, would always be quietly attended to. He had grown up inside a comfort I had created, and he had never been asked to step outside it long enough to feel its shape. This was not a reason to blame myself. I was done with that particular exercise, had spent enough of my 50s doing it. But it was worth understanding, because understanding it changed what I thought the right response was. An ultimatum would have solved nothing. I had seen women issue ultimatums to their children, had a friend years ago who had cut off her son completely over money and had spent the next decade oscillating between righteousness and grief. The cutting off had hurt her more than it had changed him. What I wanted was not to punish Daniel. I wanted to change the terms. I wanted us to find, if it was still possible, and I genuinely did not know whether it was, a different kind of relationship. One where I was visible. One where my presence was wanted rather than useful. One where the love between us was mutual in practice, not just in feeling. I wrote this down in the notebook. I wrote badly, in fragments, with the particular abandon that comes from writing in the dark on a cold terrace in a country that is not your own. But by the time the light began to come up over the hills, that particular Alentasian light, pink and copper and slow, I had written 12 pages, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Anna found me on the terrace at 7 o'clock with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. She sat down without asking and poured for both of us. "Couldn't sleep?" she said. "Too much to think about." She nodded. She was 54 and had a quiet competence about her, the ease of someone who has made several large decisions and survived them all. She and James had left London 8 years ago, sold a flat in Islington, and used the money to buy the Quinta, which had been a ruin at that point. They had rebuilt it mostly themselves over 3 years, living in 2 rooms while the rest was uninhabitable, learning masonry and plumbing and olive pressing as they went. "Do you regret leaving?" I asked. "England, your careers, all of it?" She thought about this seriously, the way I had noticed Portuguese people tend to think about questions, without rushing to fill the silence. "No," she said at last. "But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't frightening. Even now, sometimes. The difference is that the fear is about real things, a failed harvest, a bad season, not about what people think of you." I understood that distinction precisely. Cecilia and I walked 8 miles on our 3rd morning together, through a valley of cork oaks whose stripped trunks glowed rust and orange in the winter light. We talked almost the entire way. She told me about her eldest child, a daughter named Vivienne, who lived in London and whom Cecilia had not seen in 2 years. The estrangement had not come from cruelty, not the dramatic kind at least. It had come from accumulation. Year after year, Cecilia had traveled to Vivienne. Vivienne had never once traveled to her. Year after year, Cecilia had asked about Vivienne's life. Vivienne had rarely asked about hers. The conversations they had were pleasant and warm, and left Cecilia feeling, as she put it, like a vending machine. Nice to visit when you need something. Otherwise, just standing there. "The saddest part," Cecilia said, stepping over a root in the path, "is that I don't think Vivienne means to be this way. I think she simply never learned to think of me as a person with my own interior life. I was always just her mother, and in the beginning that was enough for me." "What changed?" "I turned 65. She laughed her enormous laugh. "I looked in the mirror and I thought, You have perhaps 20 more years of reasonable health, and you have been spending those years waiting for your children to have time for you, waiting for someone to ask how you are. And I thought, what if no one ever asks? Will you have waited your whole life for nothing? We walked in silence for a while. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal with minimal effort. "Have you spoken to Vivienne?" I asked. "About how you feel?" "I tried once. She cried and said she had no idea I felt that way and would do better. For about 3 months she called more often. Then it went back to how it was." Cecilia shrugged. "Which is why I stopped trying to change her and started trying to change myself." "Is that working?" "Ask me in 5 years," she said. "But so far, yes. I sleep better. I eat better. I am interested in things again. I think that counts." On the 8th day of my trip, I received an email from Renata. It was carefully written. I could tell she had spent time on it. It acknowledged, in general terms, that things had been strained lately. It said that Daniel was struggling with the changes in my behavior. It said, and this is the part I keep returning to, that the children were confused by the shift in family dynamics, and that she hoped, for the sake of Sophie and Freddie, that we could get back to how things were. I read the email twice on the terrace of the Quinta, with the olive trees in the early morning light and a cup of coffee going cold beside me. How things were. She wanted to return to how things were. I understood then, completely and without bitterness, that Renata and Daniel did not understand what had changed. They thought I was upset about something specific, a particular slight, a misunderstanding, perhaps the hospital visit, something that could be apologized for and resolved and returned to the drawer. They did not understand that I had not changed my feelings. I had changed my understanding of my own life. I did not respond to the email that day. I went for a walk instead, through the red gold hills, and thought about what I actually wanted my life to look like. I wanted to be useful on my own terms. Not because someone needed money or childcare or an emergency fund they hadn't asked permission to draw from. I wanted friends who called for no reason, the way Patricia called, the way Helen called, the way Cecilia and I had already started calling each other. I wanted mornings like this one, slow, mine, lit by winter sun. I wanted to stop performing the role of good mother so vigorously that I had forgotten to simply be one. I also wanted my grandchildren. That was the complicated part. Sophie and Freddie were 8 years old and entirely blameless, and they made me laugh in a way that nothing else did. They were the part of the equation that had no clean resolution. I thought about this carefully. And then, on the terrace of the guest house in southern Portugal, I wrote a long letter to my son. I wrote it by hand, in my best handwriting, on notepaper I bought in the village shop. It took me most of the afternoon. I told him I loved him. I was careful and specific about this. I listed particular memories, small and large, because I wanted him to understand that my love for him was not a general sentiment, but a detailed, accumulated thing. The way he had cried at his wedding, openly and without embarrassment. The time he was 12 and had stayed up all night with me when I had a fever, bringing me glasses of water and damp cloths for my forehead, more solicitous than most adults would have been. The look on his face, the first time he held Sophie. Then I told him the truth. I told him I had given money over the years, not because I was asked, but because I had decided it was what good mothers did. I told him that I had never expected repayment, but that I had, perhaps without fully knowing it, expected something else. Presence, attention, the ordinary evidence of being important to someone. I told him that when I was in the hospital, I had felt very alone. Not because he hadn't come, or not only because of that, but because I had realized, lying there, how rarely he asked how I was without needing something first. I told him that I was not angry, that I was not issuing an ultimatum, and that I was not asking him to become a different person. I was only asking him to understand that I was going to become a different version of myself. One who traveled and spent money on herself and called friends for long, rambling conversations and did not sit quietly in the stiff chair off the hallway waiting to be needed. I told him that I wanted very much to be part of his children's lives, that I was asking only to be met halfway, that the visits and the calls and the space in their lives be genuine, not transactional, that I wanted to be their grandmother, not their grandmother who also pays. I ended by telling him that I had booked myself 6 more nights at the Quinta because I had decided I wasn't ready to come home yet, and that I found I did not feel guilty about this, which surprised me, and also, I thought, might be a good sign. I posted the letter the next morning. Daniel called 2 weeks after I returned home. He had received the letter. His voice was different from any voice I had heard from him in years. Quieter, slower, stripped of the managed quality it usually carried. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know you felt that way." "I know you didn't," I said. I think I assumed that because you never said anything, it was okay." "That was my mistake too," I said. "I should have said something much sooner." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry I didn't come to the hospital." "Thank you for saying that." "Renata and I have been talking. It was hard for her to hear some of the things you wrote. But she knows you're right." A pause. "We both know you're right." I felt something ease in my chest. Not resolution. I knew better than to expect clean resolution. But the beginning of something real. "Would you like to come for Sunday lunch?" he asked. "Not because we need anything. Just to have Sunday lunch." "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." That Sunday, when I arrived, Renata opened the door and said, "I'm glad you're here." Sophie and Freddie had made a sign that said, "Welcome, Granny." I stayed 4 hours. No one asked for anything. No one mentioned the bathroom. That was 18 months ago. I have learned that generosity given freely is beautiful, but generosity that hollows you out is something else entirely. I have been back to Portugal twice. Cecilia and I speak every Sunday. She stayed there, a small apartment in Tavira, ceramics, her own life. My grandchildren call on Tuesday evenings now. 12 minutes of jokes, football updates, and questions about my garden. The best 12 minutes of my week. I have not given Daniel any more money. I may again, one day, in a way that is chosen rather than extracted. Last spring, I updated my will, not as a punishment, as a reflection of who I am now. I started writing, not a book, but something that might become one. I joined a community writing class. 9 women, ages 31 to 78. Surinder said, "Your way of describing it, being extracted from, that is exactly right." I thought, this is why telling matters. For recognition, for the relief of knowing you are not alone. The relationship with Daniel has genuinely changed. He calls more often. He brought soup when I had a cold. He fell asleep on my sofa. But we are still rebuilding. Old habits on both sides. It is an ongoing practice. Renata and I reached an accord. She admitted she had seen me more as a resource than a person. "I don't want to be that person," she said, "especially not to you." Sophie and Freddie are 9 now. Sophie calls about historical maps. Freddie saves up things for the Tuesday calls. Grandparenthood is its own gift. If you are somewhere in the middle of what I described, waiting to be needed, adding up the costs of everyone else's life, hear this. Your needs are not an imposition. You are allowed to say, quietly, I am going to live now. I am 71. I have a good heart. Portugal in January. Tuesday evenings. Sunday calls. Patricia's terrible puns. A notebook full of things I am still trying to say properly. And I have Daniel. Not because I loved him into it. Because I finally stopped pretending that love without honesty is enough. My mother was right. You cannot love anyone into treating you well. But sometimes, if you are honest and patient and brave enough to stop waiting, they find their way there on their own. Thank you for listening. Give yourself permission to live.